2,000 years ago, Rome ruled an empire stretching from England to Persia. Christ's beloved disciple John lived during those momentous days, and God took him behind the scenes in symbolic vision and showed him the sinister forces at work to shape the destiny of the empire. In this program, David explains this fascinating revelation.
This is the Roman Forum, and this is at the very heart of the old Roman Empire. This is where Caesars reigned and ruled over a vast empire. Here you find the very Senate house that Julius Caesar was assassinated in, the Arch of Titus, in which is depicted the conquest of Jerusalem, men carrying the 7 golden candlesticks back from the temple. And here were enacted the great scenes of Roman history. Historians like Gibbon, in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, have analysed the reasons for the rise and the fall of this great empire. But if you really want to know the reason behind it all, you need to turn to the Bible, because that takes us behind the scenes and lets us know just what was happening in reality. In Revelation chapter 12 in particular is a very interesting prophecy, where it says in verses 1 to 3, "Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then, being with child, she cried out in labour and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven, behold, a great fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads." You might say, you can't make head or tail of that. Well, the only way to really understand Bible prophecy is to allow the Bible to interpret its own symbols. And we can do that. For instance, in verse 9, it tells us concerning this great red dragon. "The great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan." Now, I don't want you to think that the devil actually looks like this. This is simply a symbol depicting his very nasty character. But it does take us behind the scenes and enable us to know what is going on there. Do you remember it said in Revelation 12 that he had 7 heads? Well, it explains that in chapter 17 and in verse 9. "The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come." Now these kings, or kingdoms, must refer to the 5 great kingdoms which opposed the people of God. First of all, of course, there were the Egyptians, who cast the Israelites into slavery. And then there were the Assyrians, who came down like the wolf on the fold and took the 12 or 10 tribes of Israel into captivity. Then came the Babylonians, who conquered Babylon. And then came the Medo-Persians. Remember, the people of God, the Jewish people, were nearly destroyed by the Medo-Persians, who tried to wipe them out in one day. And then came the Greeks with Antiochus Epiphanes, who persecuted the Jewish people. And then finally came Rome. Now, those are the 5 have fallen. Rome is. And that is the kingdom that is here referred to. So, here we're talking in Revelation 12 about the dragon, or the devil, working behind the scenes against the people of God. Now, what about the woman who was attacked by this great red dragon? Well, in Bible prophecy, a woman represents a church, or the people of God generally. For instance, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and in verse 2, where Paul was writing to the Christian church at Corinth, he said, "For I am jealous for you with godly jealousy. For I have betrothed you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. So you see, a good woman represents a good church, or the people of God. Now it tells us here in Revelation 12 and in verse 5, she bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Jesus Christ was destined to be the ruler of the universe, rule all nations. One day he will come again, and then he will be King of kings, Lord of lords, and he will rule all the nations of the earth. And he, of course, was the child that was caught up to God and to his throne. After his crucifixion and burial, he rose from the dead and was carried up into the highest heavens. And so he is the child referred to here. The woman is the church, or the people of God, into whose midst he was born. Now it says in verse 13, when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. You see, when Jesus was caught up to God and to his throne, the devil could no longer tempt him, annoy him, or persecute him. And so the devil now turns his attention on the woman, or the people of God. And we're told in verse 6, then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. And so the church was obliged to flee into the wilderness. That doesn't necessarily mean a sandy desert. It simply means some uninhabited place. And that is where the people of God were obliged to flee from the persecution of, if you please, not pagans, but rather fellow Christians. And so they were obliged to flee to the mountains of northern Italy and other places where they could escape from this persecution. And the Bible says that they were to be in hiding there, in refuge, take refuge there for 1,260 days. Now, in prophetic time, we notice that there is a period of 360 days. So, one time would be 360 days, that's 12 months of 30 days each. The Jewish calendar was a lunar calendar, actually about 29 and a half days. In prophetic time, it's apparently usually worked out as 360. Times, or 2 times, would be 720 days, and half a time, here we are, half is what I should put there, and that would be half of 360 is 180. Add it all up, and we have a period of 1,260 days. Now, just in case you think I'm fixing the figures, it specifically tells us here in Revelation 12:6, the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there 1,260 days. Now, in Ezekiel chapter 4 and in verse 6, we're told a day in prophecy represents a year. So here's a period of 1,260 years. It commenced when the papal power became a political stronghold. Now, you see, it always was a religious church. But in the year 538, the Emperor Justinian placed his armies at the disposal of the Pope of Rome to destroy 3 nations which had opposed the papal teaching. The Vandals in North Africa, and the Heruli in Switzerland, and the Ostrogoths in Italy, and they were liquidated by the Roman armies at the order of the Pope of Rome. So here's a period of 1,260 years. Adding this together, we come to 1798 AD. Incidentally, this is the same period referred to in Daniel chapter 7 concerning this same power, where it also speaks about a time, times, and the dividing of time. All right, now what happened in 1798? It was in that year that Napoleon Bonaparte sent his armies under General Berthier down to Rome. They occupied the Vatican, and took the Pope prisoner and exiled him to France, and he died there the following year. It looked as though the papal power was finished. Of course, we know it wasn't. And so here is a period of 1,260 years during which there were to be long centuries of terrible persecution against the true people of God. So the true Christians were to seek refuge in the wilderness, in the uninhabited places of the earth, in places where they could escape from their persecutors. And in particular, I think this refers to the people who lived in northern Italy, escaping from papal persecution. They were called the Waldenses, and they lived in what is known as the Waldensian Mountains. It's a rugged place, and a visit there certainly makes you feel that you're in the uninhabited places of the world. And here they sought refuge. They were sometimes hounded and were obliged to worship in caves and in valleys where nobody lived. And sometimes their persecutors did catch up with them, and then they mercilessly put them to death. But these courageous people witnessed for God. They were named after Peter Waldo, their leader, who dared to stand up against the might of Rome. And he left this very interesting monument, or rather this monument has been made to him, this statue of Peter Waldo up there in the Waldensian Mountains. And there is also a very interesting pillar. It's a natural pillar actually, but down at the bottom there is a verse from the Bible. And it says there, it quotes actually from this very prophecy in Revelation chapter 12 and in verse 13, where it says, "And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death." There in verse 11 it tells us that they were willing to lay down their lives, and that's the inscription that is found at the bottom of this pillar. And so these Waldensian people faithfully witnessed for God. Now we are told here in Revelation 12 and verse 15, "The serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman." In Psalm 18 and verse 4 it speaks of floods of ungodly men. And these people were hounded by people who had a lot of so-called Christianity but not much really true heart religion. And they were out to kill these Waldenses. But it says that the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth time and again when they were obliged to flee. And their persecutors were hot on their heels. It just seems that the mists of the mountains rolled down and swallowed them up, just exactly as the Bible prophecy says. This building is known as the Castle of St. Angelo. It's a very old building, and at one stage it was occupied by the popes as a residence. It was a place where people were imprisoned for their faith, and there are tunnels underneath where their bodies were washed out into the Tiber when they died. Today it is a museum, and inside is some interesting relics from the era of persecution. I'm sure you've all heard of the Spanish Inquisition. Well, some of the torture methods that were used there were really quite sophisticated. For instance, in the Horniman Museum in London, where I am at the present time, there is this torture chair. Just have a look at it, will you? The victim was fastened in there. His head was fastened in that contraption there. This thing was screwed up to hold his mouth open, and there was a clip that was forced onto his nose. On the side are these screws which are screwed right into the ears, and you can imagine just what agony that would produce. These are just some of the tortures that were used during the Spanish Inquisition and other places of persecution during the period of the Dark Ages. Then came the great Protestant Reformation. Men like Martin Luther in Germany, John Wesley in England. In fact, just at the moment I'm standing in front of Wesley's church, and Wesley's statue here, underneath it is written, "The world is my parish." What a great man he was. And there was John Knox in Scotland, great men of God. But I think the Protestant Reformation needed to go further. You see, in the very last verse of this fascinating prophecy of Revelation chapter 12, bringing us right down to the end of time, it says, "And the dragon was enraged with the woman." Now that means that the devil was really angry with the church of God. "And he went to make war with the rest of her offspring," or the remnant of her offspring. Now that's right down at the end of time, the end of the church's experience. And we are told who these people are. who keep the commandments of God. Now, they're distinguished by the fact that they keep the commandments of God. Well, the traditional Protestant church has always professed to keep the 10 commandments. But this is speaking about a church that not only professes to, but actually keeps, not some of them, not 9 of them, but the whole 10. And that would include the seventh-day Sabbath. And I consider that this must refer to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which not only professes but actually observes all the commandments, including the seventh day. Now, the Adventist Church sprang up in the year 1844, and it observed the seventh-day Sabbath from then on. Seventh-day Adventists had small beginnings, but today they have a worldwide membership that extends everywhere. And they worship in churches, large churches like this, or little humble churches in countries and villages. They also operate in a very extensive educational and medical work all over the world. I am on the campus of Andrews University, which is an educational institution operated and owned by Seventh-day Adventists in Michigan in the United States of America. It's quite a large university, has over 3,000 students enrolled here, and they come from 80 different countries around the world or more, which means that it is one of the most cosmopolitan educational institutions in the United States of America. The courses offered here are not only on theology, but on the sciences, the arts, on education, business lines, you name it. There's a good educational program here. Not only do Seventh-day Adventists operate this university, there's some 80 colleges and universities around the world operated by Adventists, and some 800 secondary educational institutions and 4,000 primary educational schools. And that means that Seventh-day Adventists operate the most extensive educational system of any Protestant denomination in the world. I am standing in front of Sydney Adventist Hospital in Australia. This is one of more than 50 such well-equipped hospitals that are owned and operated by Seventh-day Adventists around the world. And this particular hospital is very well equipped. For instance, it has a cancer unit for caring for patients not only with chemotherapy but also with radium treatments. It does open heart surgery here, has an excellent department of physiotherapy and also hydrotherapy, you know, those good treatments, that hot and cold water that make you feel so good afterwards. And there is also a blood transfusion facility here. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe in blood transfusions. Well, Seventh-day Adventists do. And often it's a lifesaver. Of course, the blood needs to be well screened and tested, but often it can save lives. And so this is a church that is doing things and going places. And after all, that's what we should expect, you know. Because in Revelation 14 and in verse 6 there is a latter-day prophecy that says, "I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to them that dwell on the earth, and to every nation and kindred and tongue and people." Well, Seventh-day Adventists feel a responsibility to the whole world. And we feel that here is a prophecy symbolizing the work that we're doing. So it's a good church to belong to.
The rise and growth of the Adventist church in the world is one of the greatest miracles of modern mission. When the church first came into existence, there were a handful of believers. Now the Adventist church is the most widespread single Protestant denomination in the whole world, solidly planted in over 190 countries in the world. What are the reasons for the particular spread and its success? Firstly, the people who are involved in the Adventist mission have a powerful vision. That doesn't mean, of course, that the Adventists believe that we are the only ones who are instruments in the hands of God to accomplish His kingdom. To the contrary, Adventists hold to an inclusive understanding of mission, which means we do recognize other instruments and channels of God's grace. But we cannot leave to others what God in His mercy has specifically entrusted to this church. Second, a hallmark of the Adventist mission is its universalism. Not only have we penetrated now over 190 countries in the world, and is this beautiful message being proclaimed in over 700 languages in the world, but the message doesn't stop also at cultural boundaries or boundaries of politics. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Adventist mission is that we have churches planted in the communist world, the world behind the Iron Curtain, in the Buddhist world, in the Islamic world, in the big cities, in the rural areas, in Stone Age New Guinea still. And that universalism, of course, creates certain difficulties and tensions. But one third aspect of the Adventist mission is that it has kept, in spite of this, a tremendous unity. A unity which is not only stimulated by a particular world organization with its headquarters in the different continents of the world, but it's a unity of the spirit, unity of the one God and the one belief. One striking aspect, however, is this, that Adventist mission is characterized by a comprehensiveness that is unique among the missionary bodies in the world today. And that comprehensiveness goes back to two sources. In the first place, to the Bible itself. Adventists believe that man as a whole is a unity. So is life. And therefore, when you approach man and life, they ought to be approached holistically, comprehensively. And that means that Adventist mission from the very beginning has not only been concerned about people's salvation, their relationship with God, sin, but also with how they live, what they shall eat and what they shall not eat, concerned about their education, about their health. So the Adventist Church from the very beginning has begun programs in agricultural development, in school systems. In many areas in the world it was the first where we started a hospital system. And the reason is, of course, this holistic view of man and life. Second is that it goes back to the founder of the Adventist mission, namely Mrs. Ellen G. White, who from the very beginning has always stressed that Adventist mission must be comprehensive. The result is not only that millions of people have found a new way of life, a new meaning in life, a new sense and direction in their life, conversion, salvation, with all the joy and the peace that it brings in a person's life, but also society at large has been strongly influenced by wherever the Adventist Church has planted its mission. In some areas in the world, for instance, laws became changed, even a constitution became changed as a result of the Adventist work. In other areas, a new work ethic, for instance, began to develop. Whole countries, whole island communities, from the South Pacific to the Caribbean, have found a new economic basis of their life because Adventists taught them how to behave, how to live, and accept a new lifestyle. Adventists, wherever they worked, have influenced society in new agrarian and economic reforms. One of the most exciting events that is coming out of northern Ghana, for instance, is that whereas in most areas in the world, people are drifting out of the rural areas into the big city, where they crowd into the slum areas in the world, Adventists have had a great concern about it, and it started here an agricultural development program. The result was that instead of leaving the areas, the rural areas, as they did before, now the people stay there, they have found a new income there. The government of Ghana is so excited about it that they had made a study on the effects of this mission, and they discovered not only that people found a new joy and a new happiness in life, but in particular that people found a new economic existence in northern Ghana, which prevented thousands and thousands of people from flocking into the slum areas of the big cities like anywhere else in the world. Other organizations, like aid organizations, who have been watching Adventist mission, both in its influence on individuals as well as on society at large, now are pouring literally millions of dollars into the Adventist Church's mission with a request to continue this particular work, not only for the benefit of individuals or to establish a particular religion, but in particular because they have seen what good and what effect it has had on society at large. And one of the new developments in Adventist mission, therefore, is a movement which we call ADRA, Adventist Development and Relief Agency. The millions of dollars are being spent here in agricultural development, in industrial development, not just to be competing with industries or with nation building, but rather to help the people in their holistic understanding of themselves and of life to find a better living as a whole.
Now, the important thing is that here is a church that not only believes in Jesus Christ as the Saviour from sin, but who shows their faith in Christ by obedience to the 10 Commandments, including the seventh-day Sabbath. And that's the way it should be, you know, because in Revelation 14 and in verse 12, it says, "Here are they that keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. Wouldn't you like to be among those people that God points to and says, here they are. Here are those that keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. Now, there are some people who might say, well, yes, that'll be good, but, you know, it's a bit hard to change. A lot of sacrifice involved. I don't think there is, really. There's not a lot of sacrifice involved in following truth. But on this question of sacrifice, you know, while I was in Jerusalem, I purchased a crown of thorns. And the Bible tells us that when Jesus Christ was crucified, the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his brow. I don't think they just sat it there, they crushed it down. And these points have a poisonous barb on the end of them, you know. And it must have been very painful. That's the sacrifice that Jesus Christ made for us, so that we could have eternal life. Remember the sacrifices the Waldenses made. They shed their blood for their faith. So if you're talking about sacrifice, really, what God is asking us to do today is not very much. And it'll be great to be numbered among those who keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus Christ.
In our next programme, we'll be leaving the island of Patmos in the Mediterranean for the United States of America. There, David will be discussing the meaning of the mark of the beast.